I'm not going to say anything else, and I'd like to welcome Michael Hyland, who will introduce this evening's talk.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The topic today is depression. Depression has been a problem not just today, but for many years. In 1638, Burton wrote his Anatomy of Melancholy, which not only sets out the nature of depression, but also gives a variety of cures which range from herbalism to going to a witch for a cure. Now, the modern treatment of depression starts in 1952 with the chance discovery that a particular drug which was being used to treat tuberculosis also seemed to cheer up patients. The very first class of drugs, the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, was actually introduced into patient use only in the 1960s. But shortly after that, the introduction of the antidepressants with new types gradually increased. Despite our... Oh, good Lord. Could you hear me at the back? Right. Despite... Oh, I won't repeat it for the people. Despite the developments in modern drug taking, depression remains a problem. And we never get the right thing. The one on the right, yes. Here is some data on the extent to which depression is a problem in Europe. It accounts for 1% of gross domestic product, which is an incredible amount. 21 million in Europe are affected by depression. And it equivalents to €253 per person per year in Europe. So it is an immense cost. If we look at the total cost, it's broken down into varying categories. 118 billion euros. It's an immense amount of money. Drug costs, you note, is 9 billion. The indirect costs, which is the costs, lost productivity, is 76 billion pounds. So it's an immense problem despite the treatments we have available to us. Now, we're going to have a debate between, on my right hand, and your left hand, Irving Kirsch and Simon Love. And they're going to debate the use of antidepressants. Should we use drugs, or should we use something else? So I'm going to ask Irving Kirsch to talk for 15 to 20 minutes, and followed by Simon, who will talk for 15 to 20 minutes. I'll then ask Irving to reply to Simon, and Simon to reply to Irving, at which point I'll open it up to discussion from the floor. And if you want to make a point or have a question to raise, please raise your hand, and I'll try and get as many comments or questions from the floor as possible. So without any further ado, I'd like to put it over to Irving, who's going to talk.
I'm also the technical support, so... I used to believe that antidepressants work. I was working as a psychotherapist, and when I had very depressed patients, I'd refer them for prescriptions of antidepressants. And then I started looking at the data. And what I saw surprised me, because it seemed like most of the effect that you got from giving a patient an antidepressant was placebo effect. And so I decided to do a more thorough meta-analysis, and I went to the FDA with some colleagues and obtained all of the data that the drug companies had sent them in the process of getting approval for what at that time were the most widely prescribed antidepressant drugs. Now, going to the Food and Drug Administration, which is the agency that approves drugs for marketing in the U.S., was important because the FDA data set is unique in a number of ways. First of all, it's the basis upon which drugs are approved. If there's anything wrong with these data, then arguably the drugs should not have been approved in the first place. Second, they include all of the trials that the FDA has deemed to be adequate and well controlled, and that's important because I learned later, it turned out that 40% of the trials that had been conducted by the drug companies on their products were never published. They were hidden. The data were hidden. And it's not hard to figure out why. If you look at the trials that have been published, you see a very nice picture for antidepressants. 3/4 of them show a significant benefit for the drug over placebo. If you look at the unpublished trials, however, you get a very different picture. Only 12% show a significant benefit for drug over placebo. So we had now a complete data set. We had the published trial data, we had the unpublished trial data. We put them together and looked to see how large was the response to the real drug and how large was the response to placebo and what was the difference between them. And here's what we found on the most widely used scale for measuring depression. It's called the Hamilton Rating Scale for Depression. A scale that ranges, you can get 0 means no symptoms at all. The highest one could possibly get, nobody gets it high, would be 53. The drug, people getting the drug improved on an average 10 points. Some improved more than that, some didn't improve at all. The average improvement was 10 points, and that's pretty good. That's a clinically significant, meaningful improvement in someone's life. People also improved substantially if they were given a placebo. Over 8 points. It means the difference was less than 2 points on this scale. And so what does that mean? Is that important? Is it not important? Nice. Wrong button again. Nice. The Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence has established a criteria. For the magnitude of a drug placebo difference in order for it to be considered clinically significant. And that criterion in terms of Hamilton points is 3 points. There has to be at least a 3-point difference between improvement on the drug and improvement on placebo. And as you can see, the difference is considerably less than that. Now, I should mention the difference between clinical significance and statistical significance. What we're talking about is clinical significance. You see, statistical significance has to do with how reliable an effect is. Is it real? Would it happen again if we did another study? Or is it just a chance finding? Clinical significance has to do with how large the effect is. How much meaning would it have for a person in their everyday life? Let's take an example. Imagine a study has been done on 500,000 people and has found that smiling increases life expectancy by 10 seconds. With 500,000 subjects in the study, I can virtually guarantee you that the results will be statistically significant, but they're not clinically meaningful. Our meta-analysis stirred a lot of interest, a lot of debate, a lot of controversy, and so other meta-analyses were done. Some using the same data we use, some using overlapping data, some using completely different data, and everybody gets the same results. The difference between drug and placebo in the antidepressant trials, it's small and it's well below NICE's criterion for clinical significance. Now, I should mention that there are some patients who do get a significant, clinically significant, may get a clinically significant benefit from the drug that they don't get on placebo, and that, the way of knowing which patients there are, we do know which they are, it has to do with severity of depression. Mildly depressed patients get no benefit beyond placebo, neither do moderately depressed patients. Severely depressed patients don't either. Very severely depressed patients, most of them, do not get a clinically significant benefit, but there is a small group of extremely depressed patients, and they seem to get a benefit beyond that which you get with by giving them placebo. These are from 2 different meta-analyses, so very similar results, as you can see. How large a group of people are we talking about, the millions worldwide who are prescribed antidepressants? Well, this is the distribution. This is how many people there are out of those who suffer from major depressive disorder in these trials, who have various levels of severity. And what you'll see is those that are in the group that get a clinically significant benefit, those are 10% of the patients in the trials. That means 90% of depressed patients are not getting a clinically significant benefit. And what I can also tell you is that this is probably an underestimate of the degree to which people are getting a clinically significant benefit. And it's an underestimate because the people who go into clinical trials are carefully selected. They're selected to be people who are most likely to benefit from drugs and least likely to show a placebo response. They exclude people with other disorders, comorbidity it's called. They're excluded from the trials. They exclude, the trials are usually done on more affluent, well-to-do people. You don't have many minority people in the trials. You don't have unemployed people. You don't have chronically depressed people. You don't have people who haven't responded to drug treatment for depression before previous attempts to treat their depression. With that selected group of people, you get a response rate of about 50% on drug, about 40% on placebo. There have been some studies done with broader populations, with the kind of people who are excluded from clinical trials, and their response is even worse. Their response is even worse. Those are the benefits, if we can call them that, of antidepressant drugs. What about the risks? Well, there are the side effects that you're warned about in the leaflets. For SSRIs, the most prominent one is sexual dysfunction that occurs on 70 to 80% of people. There's also long-term weight gain, insomnia, diarrhea, nausea. And then, if you want to stop taking your drugs, you have the problem of withdrawal symptoms, which affect about 20% of patients who try to get off of antidepressant drugs. There are support groups now for patients trying to get off of antidepressant drugs. And then there are the health risks, which include suicide in children and young adults, stroke, death from all causes in the elderly, gastrointestinal bleeding, birth defects, autism, and this is the one that surprises all the psychiatrists that I talk to, an increased risk in relapse of becoming depressed again after you get off of the drugs. Why are they surprised? Because here's the data that they love to show. The 2 pieces of data that are going to be on your left-hand side. They say, look, we have these trials, these relapse prevention trials, where we take people who have responded to the drug, they've gotten better, and now we randomize them to either stay on the drug or get switched to placebo. And you know what happens? People that get switched to placebo, almost half of them relapse, they get depressed again. Whereas those that stay on the drug, only 23% of them relapses, half the relapse rate. You see, it's better to be on the real drug. Well, what they leave out in these studies are people who got better on placebo. What happens if you take people who've gotten better on placebo and you keep them on placebo? Here's the relapse rate. It's the same as getting on the drug and staying on the drug. This increase in relapse rate may be a function of having been on the drug for 6 to 8 weeks at the beginning of the trial. and if that doesn't convince you, those data don't convince you, then look at this. Here are relapse rates as a function of, you might call it the strength of the drug, the degree to which the drug affects neurotransmission in your brain. The greater the impact on neurotransmission, the higher the relapse rate. And if that doesn't convince you, here's a lovely study that was done on physical exercise as a treatment for depression. Depressed patients were assigned randomly to either get an SSRI, antidepressant drug, to be given an exercise program, physical exercise, or given an exercise program and an SSRI. After 4 months of treatment, you got pretty much the same results in all three groups. Not much difference at all, and very nice results, actually, if you compare to typical clinical trial results. Getting around 60% remission, which means that they are close to being symptom-free. Here are the relapse rates. On SSRI, the relapse rate, and they're allowed to continue on their drugs, the relapse rate was 38%. On exercise, only 8% relapsed and became depressed again. What about the combination? Exercise and drug. Relapse rate, 31%. This difference right here, that's the increased relapse as a function of adding drug to an effective exercise program. That's pretty bad news for people who are already on antidepressants. What about people who are coming into treatment for the first time? What should we do, given that risk-benefit relationship? Well, there are alternatives. Psychotherapy is as effective as antidepressant medication in the short term, with a much lower risk of relapse in the long term. Combining psychotherapy and antidepressant drugs isn't much better than either one alone. Exercise, acupuncture, they both work, as well as drugs and psychotherapy. Placebo works a little bit less. Treatment, as usual, works about like a placebo. And these are people who are continuing to see their doctor, most of them getting antidepressant medication. Doing nothing doesn't work. People don't just spontaneously recover. You've got to do something. But doesn't it make sense if you have a number of treatments that are all equally effective to start out by prescribing that which causes the least harm, which has the least risks? What we are doing as a society, and what psychiatrists are doing now as a profession, and general practitioners as well, is to start with the most dangerous treatment, which has no benefit over less dangerous treatments. So my conclusions are, antidepressants are outrageously overprescribed. I saw a physician yesterday, and I complained to him, you know, this is the first of 14 talks that I'm giving in 6 countries in the next 2 months. I said, I'm really stressed out by this speaking schedule. Do you know what he said to me, not knowing about my professional life? And I'm kidding you not. Why don't you try an antidepressant for the next couple of months? They dole them out like candy. Antidepressants, if they are prescribed at all, should be prescribed only as a last resort, and only for people who are extremely severely depressed, and only after other treatments have been tried and have failed. And then if they don't work, instead of loading on, oh, try a different antidepressant, it really doesn't make a difference. I could show you data on that as well. Or giving them two drugs to take, or 3 or 4 in this cocktail that no one has ever studied. Discontinue it if it doesn't work. And that's all I have to say. Most of this comes from my book, The Emperor's New Drugs. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Evan. That was absolutely excellent. And now we're going to turn to Simon Love from Cerebral Health, who's going to give his perception.
Hello? 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 Okay, yeah, my name's Simon Love. I run Cerebral Health, which is a user-led organisation or a person with lived experience organisation in the field of mental health, but we prefer to call it Cerebral Health because we're not all axe-wielding maniacs. I do like to eat children, but we're not all potentially dangerous, and that's what it implies. It was really great to be invited today. We are on Facebook. you can. Oh, sorry, it's duplicated. That's where the power lies. Yeah, it's a really emotive subject, and I've been involved in this for a long time. Bipolar disorder runs in my family. I've got bipolar disorder, or another way of being, as I prefer to look at it. And it's troubled me for a long time, and actually it was because of the terrible services I received. I went and studied psychology, then did a postgraduate. And then in 2007 I lost my life, really. I had a major manic episode, psychotic, ended up being sectioned under the Mental Health Act. And they were all very well prepared to section me. But they didn't care about my employment or liaising with my employer, or considering my mortgage, or considering my job, or my partner's needs, and the pressure put on my partner. And after the mania came the depression, and then a suicide attempt, and then a loss of a relationship, a natural support system, an economic cost associated with that, because after that I ended up in supported housing, which cost an awful lot of money, but I was still taking the medication. So if you're looking for an argument today with Evan, it's not really going to happen, except on one point, which comes a little later with Evan, because I'm actually in agreement in many ways, and actually I fought the system because I knew it wasn't working for me. Because let me tell you one thing before we go any further. If you live alone, in isolation, no structure, no routine, no sense of purpose, you will all be depressed. And what you generally see with people who are in housing support, and those type of things, the 92% of people who are unemployed with severe and enduring mental illness, the 80% with depression, or a recognisable diagnostic label associated with depression, who are unemployed, is what you see is that lifestyle. No structure, routine, sense of purpose, or social contact. We are human beings. We are meant to have social contact. We're meant to have purpose. When we don't have that, if any of you have been unemployed for any length of time, life starts to get a little bit messy. I've jumped ahead of myself. I do that. But what's interesting is after I was invited to do this, is I started thinking about it in great detail, because my thinking was in line with this to some degree, because I've been on medication since about 14. First thing that was popped to me when my parents were divorcing, and it was a pretty ugly message, take this, and I remember these terrible side effects, but something Irvin said in his book which really connected with me. When I started experiencing those side effects, I thought, oh, it's going to work, because it's real medication, I'm feeling it, my lips are dry. I was 14 as well. I think my sexual drive decreased slightly. I can't quite remember. But it's an extremely emotive subject. And when I started to broach it with people, I'm embedded in this, I'm engrossed in this subject. It's my passion. I come across a lot of people who are on antidepressants. Boy, people are very protective of the fact that there are antidepressants working for them, even though it's been titrated up and up and up and up and up, and it doesn't really seem to have changed their life in any major way. But because people, it's a very powerful concept to believe that this medication is going to make you well. And it's something that people will hold on to. And, because we're talking about a cure for sadness. We medicate happiness too for people with bipolar if it goes over a certain limit. But we're talking about a cure of sadness. We live in a day and age where sadness has no purpose, no place in life anymore, in this individualistic culture that we live in. My experience is subjective. I am involved in a lot of research. I went to the University of Birmingham and the Peninsula Medical School and hope to start my doctorate next year to revolutionise this field, but in a very different way. But it is subjective. But then again, it's probably less subjective than many studies. I've been engrossed in it. I'm around people who are on these medications all the time. They talk to me as an equal, not as a researcher. And I see the same thing time and time again. And what I see is this. I don't think it works. I don't think antidepressants work. I know for certain, that there are many causes of a common code. And I think we've got to bear that in mind and not have a one kind of shoe-fits-all kind of philosophy, because like Evan said, I think there are some people who will respond. The common code has about 100 different causes, but it all looks the same, and so maybe in some instances it does work, and I can't deny that. What I will tell you is that bipolar depression is probably the worst depression in terms of what it looks like. My dad's depressions, they're really bad too. Oh, you know, I had an argument with my partner. I know what you feel like now, Simon. It's really bad. And the next day, it's fine. Bipolar depression is slightly different. I mean, I fell into a long-winded depression in 2007, which went on for 6 months, and in the end, I fell into a coma because I tried to take my life, and everything was taken from me. And this is psychomotor slowing, and I hate using that terminology, but it's this. It's the kind of down, rocking, real slow movements, slow thoughts, real nervous, ruminating, constantly going over the same themes. And for me, the theme was I was a psychopath, and it's a horrible thing to be thinking about. My poor partner had to not only go out to work all day, but then she had to come home and do my dishes, and then she had to clean me. And I was struggling. The highlight of the day, the hardest part of the day was to brush my teeth, or to clean my underwear that I'd been wearing for 2 or 3 days. Oh, the self-esteem, you know, and self-flagellation were immense. It's an ugly experience, and I'm not taking anything away from that. But I think there are levels. You know, my dad's experience of depression, yeah, as horrible as it is for him, it's a little bit different. As I say, I shouldn't use my dad as an example, it's not fair. But I don't think there's any disorder really worse than hopelessness. I think hopelessness is the worst of all, and it's intrinsically linked to depression. I always link hopelessness, or my experience of it, of the lovely Labrador who in the 50s and 60s was experimented on by everybody. He's a happy lab, his tail's wagging, oh, there's a person there, they're going to stroke me, and he's a really happy guy. Stick him in a cage, lock him in a cage, administer electric shocks to him randomly over the space of 48 hours, some long, some short. For the first 40 or 50 attempts, he's going to try and get away. And then what do you think he does? He lays down and takes it. He takes it, he gives up, and that's a very, very, very ugly place to be. The suicide rate, or risk of suicide for people with bipolar depression is 30 times more likely than that of the general population. For people who are experiencing a depressive episode, it's generally about 12 to 14 times more than the general population. But the real world costs are breakdowns in relationships, loss of jobs, those things, and they certainly perpetuate the problem. But as I say, and I think this is one I'd like you to hold on to as I continue to talk, every cloud. There's some people in this room who've been trained by me, and I use this all the time, every cloud. And I think there's a lot to this statement. If we look at something as a disease, or a disability, that's what we'll see. If we flip it on its head and actually see it as having a function, as an ability, as something that can actually guide us, maybe we see it slightly differently at that time. But more than that, if it wasn't because of the terrible service I felt I received, and actually because of this medical model, which we're not seeing people recover, we're not seeing people return. We know that if you're off with depression for 6 months, the likelihood is you're not going to return to work within 5 years. You know, it's not working. We could end there. It's not working, and we need to look at something else. And so actually, it's because of all of this and this sense of injustice that I have the passion to fight for this and devise interventions and think of innovative solutions to these problems. So every cloud. How effective were the medications for me? Well, I'll just name 3. Of course, I was put onto antipsychotics because I was manic. And that just ballooned me to 17 stone. And I'm not going to focus on this so much, but I think within context it actually makes sense about the medical model. As far as antipsychotics, yeah, it sedated me. It was good for other people. But for me personally, I ballooned out to 17 stone. My life expectancy's decreased by 20 years. And oh, it's all because of all these other social factors of why that is. No, it's because you're on antipsychotics, I'm certain of it. The risk of diabetes, cardiovascular disease increased 20-fold, and being sedated all the time is not me. I had to fight the system to come off it though, you know. No, Simon, you've got to consider your mental health. You really have to. It's more important than anything else. I was a 32-year-old man. It was more important to actually feel good and look good in myself and feel confident in myself. I could eat a 700-calorie diet for 4 years. And because I ballooned up to 17, even though I'd maintained this weight all of my life up to that point, it was because I ate too much. And I needed my nutrition, my diet to be looked at. No, I didn't. And it made me furious that was there very, oh no, it can't be because you're it hasn't changed the way that, that your body functions at all. I came off it and I'm really glad that I did. Antidepressants never worked. And I have never seen anybody who's made this remarkable transition. It's not quite ecstasy, is it? And yeah, being bipolar, I've been a risk taker. Ecstasy changes you within a few minutes. It's not quite ecstasy antidepressants, and I don't see that level of effect. The one I'm not going to challenge is mood stabilizers, because since I started on 2009, I haven't had a major depressive episode in all of that time. But more than that, it leaves me photosensitive to the sun, which means I go brown easily, so I'm not even prepared to challenge that one, and maybe that's a future study. But as I say, I think what we mostly see, and what I mostly see with the people that I work with, is people living at home, alone, in isolation, with no structure, no routine, and no sense of purpose. Then you get these providers come in, and CPNs come in, and what they're really seeing, they're not seeing schizophrenia, they're not seeing bipolar disorder, they're not seeing unipolar depression, they're seeing the effect of lifestyle. No, don't work, it'll make you ill, the stress will make you ill, no, don't do that, no, lower your expectations, no, that's probably not achievable. You live like that and I promise you, you will get depressed. Why don't they seem to work? Where am I going with this? It's an Aston Martin DB7. And the reason I put an Aston Martin DB7 up there is because it's a complex machine in comparison with a Ford Fiesta. Where am I going with this? Because the brain is an extremely complex piece of kit. There's nothing like it. There's no machine known to man. There's nothing known to man that is as complex, or merely even maybe within 2-3% as complex as the human brain. You ask professors, they know how complex this piece of kit is. This body is very complex, but it's nothing. It's just a vehicle to get them to meetings, to get this to meetings. It is, isn't it? I mean, and I think as well, and this is me being slightly subjective, but I think depression is a complex mechanism. Oh, it's embedded in the emotional centre of the brain. I mean, that makes perfect sense. But I think it's actually more associated with memory, more associated with other compartments in the brain, ones that look at your own self-concept. And I'll start to give you a feel for why I think that is in a second. But finally, I think that antidepressants are extremely crude intervention. The idea that this pill here is going to change your life. Well, it's not, is it? Because everything else is going to be the same way. But what it stops us doing is looking in at ourselves. Something that we did for 5.6 million years without psychiatrists, psychologists, or anyone else. We managed to live without them. Now we become a culture totally dependent on professional intervention, and that's where I'm going to pick on Irving in a minute, because chapter 6 is not very good. And I think what we've got to really be asking, and this is what medicine doesn't do, what is the function of depression? Why is it in the gene pool? Why does it persist? Well, it does persist. And we're seeing more and more of it now, probably because we've changed the world so drastically over the last kind of 400 or 500 years. We weren't built to live this way. Our families are dispersed all around the world, not just all around the country. We work different hours. We've got media to compare ourselves with billions of different images. We weren't built to live the way that we live today. And they look at it as a disease. A disease, it's something that's external to you and it's driven. No, it's not. I think we all have a propensity towards depression. Some may be more so than others, some may be because of other causes. But disease, why would it stay in the gene pool if it was a disease? It would have been wielded out. You know, if you had 7 fingers and all you need is 5, you know, it's not going to be there because it's better and more effective and more cost effective to have 5. So I've always looked at it as an evolutionary perspective, and I didn't like my lecturer as an undergraduate in psychology, but he did introduce me to evolutionary psychology, and actually that's answered so much in my life, because it's about why is it there? It is there. Is it disease? No, the medical model is disease, but the medical model in itself is very naive in looking at it as disease, because it's not really looking at the very real biological or benefit to the organism itself. The evolutionary perspective is that really depression is generally linked to themes of loss. You get depressed when you've lost something. You've lost esteem, you've lost faith, you've lost a relationship, you've lost a loved one, which is extremely unfortunate. You've lost resources in some way. Something has been taken from your life, or you're not being able to achieve quite what you want to achieve. So what can it potentially do for us, depression? That's when it generally forms, but it's not a nice experience. And it's an experience that we want to avoid. And as children, we don't listen to what our mums say when they say, you know, don't climb that tree, you could fall out. We learn when we fall out of the tree because it hurts. So we learn different tactics to do that again. And I think the same can be said for depression. Once you've experienced depression, clinical depression, you don't want to go back there. It's not an experience that you want to get back to. So I think what it can do, if we look at it in the right way, is it can promote change. It can promote you to looking at yourself and see what's gone wrong, why has it gone wrong, what's my responsibility in that, and how can I change it? But we're in a very, very dangerous area right now, because we're moving away from looking at it that way, and we're looking at it as a pill which is going to solve it for us, and it's not, and it doesn't. So I think what it can do is it can motivate us to do something about it. It can motivate us to potentially change and stop us from doing costly things, getting involved in silly relationships, making silly decisions. I think there's too much dependency on a quick, attractive fix, and it makes sense why it is. We're a very individualistic society, you know, that we think cause and effect, take that and it's going to do that. Well, it's not that simple. We've evolved over millions of years, and depression is there for a reason. You know, let's not forget just how attractive these concepts are. And I'm not diving into religion here, and I'm not trying to condemn it, but I'm trying to give you an idea of just how powerful the idea of, if you take this, it's going to make you better, it's going to make you happy. If you live a good life, you're going to go to heaven. You know, Mother Teresa lived by that. You know, if you live a really good life, maybe you'll get a closer seat to Jesus or God in heaven. If you sacrifice your own life, you'll win virgins in heaven. These are very, very powerful concepts that actually lead to people acting in certain ways, you know, they're actually against their own benefit in many ways because of something that they perceive will happen because of it. If you have the depression disease and you take this pill, it will take away your pain. It's a very, very, very attractive offer, and one that not many people are prepared to give up very easily, and I think drug companies are very, very aware of that. The problem, as I see it, just coming towards the end now, versus the solution, I think we've got too much dependency on this ineffective medical model of depression, and I think we need to start looking at it in a different way. And in fact, I think people are. There's a really beautiful model which I adhere to in the models that we're designing and that we're delivering with the client groups that we're working with now. It's called the recovery style model, and it sounds really Californian, and I used to be anti-Californian, but I'm not anymore. The recovery style model wasn't devised by psychologists, psychiatrists, psychopharmacologists. It was devised by economists. They looked at this huge £110 billion cost to the UK economy, and what they looked at is they looked at all the factors, all of the different areas of somebody's life in the round that kind of correlated with people recovering, people going out and functioning again in society. They did a huge pilot study on it with over 2,000 odd people over a 3-year period, and they found in 78% of cases that people improved. And we started seeing hard outcomes like employment outcomes, people living again. People actually started reporting that their quality of life was better, buzzwords that we use, but their relationships were improved. The economic burden was discouraged because relationships stayed together. There's nothing worse than living with someone who is fundamentally, you know, in this clinical depression. It is a burden, and it's a stress, and it's a struggle. We have to, and this is where I wasn't very happy with Irving. Not unhappy with him, but Irving comes, you know, his background is in his background, and I think there was always going to be a bit of him in his book. But I think we have too much dependency on professional intervention. Oh, you should go and see a therapist. You know, are we missing the point that for 5.6 million years we lived without them? And that actually what we did is we had these closely knitted communities that actually looked out for each other, and they actually saw it as their role to be supportive, but more than that, we saw it within us to take responsibility for the way our lives were more, and not be so dependent on these external things that can do it for us. And I think we've drastically changed life, and I truly believe this. And I don't think that we should be putting, you know, it actually stops families from supporting each other, the breakdown of family. Now, oh, they'll look after you, or when they're old, we'll put them in a home, you know, and these kind of concepts, or, oh, the psychiatrists can do that, they look after the medication, they deal with all of those problems as the other therapists, and I think that we're missing the point. We're missing our own humanity within that. And what we don't do, and the medical model doesn't do, as I say, they encourage you to stay at home alone, but keep taking your medication because it'll keep you well. Well, it doesn't. What we've got to do is look at people's lives in the round. Look at the way that we evolved for 5.6 million years. We're like ants. We needed a function. We needed a purpose. We need structure. We're social beings. We need to be around people. Well, before you know it, you become very depressed and very socially anxious because you feel inferior. You haven't got a point to life. And we've got to start looking at people's lives in the round. And by doing that, what we're seeing with these kind of interventions is that it works. Hence, I'm here. And I'm not the exception to the rule, as my CPN used to say. When I looked at my life in the round, I got better, but I had to fight a system that was telling me, and it's a very powerful system when it tells you what's best for you. So many people put their trust in that. You know, if you've got a code and your doctor says, pull your pants down, you know, the chances are that you could. And I don't say that lightly. You put that absolute trust in someone to do something, and I think that's what we do when we hear the medical profession. We put that level of trust in it, and I think that can be potentially dangerous. And as I said, we live without psychologists and psychiatrists and CPNs for 5.5 million years. How on earth did we manage that? Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. We've had two very interesting contributions. It seems that Simon doesn't disagree with Irving with regard to the efficacy of antidepressants, but he does disagree with him on the point of professionalism and therapists in relation to treatment. So I'm now going to give Irving 5 or so minutes to respond to Simon.
I will make it 5 minutes or less, also in the hopes that there will be time for more general interaction. I think Simon's point about the medical model is well taken. Thank you. I also think his point about overlooking the adaptive function of depression is also well taken. This is the third person that I've heard since all three after writing this book, the idea that depression might be adaptive and how it might be adaptive. All three seem to agree fairly well on that. The other two are Professor Hyland and Paul Andrews at Macalester University in Canada, who's written on this. So again, point well taken. I'm sorry? Oh, I was agreeing with the criticisms of my chapter 6. And I did say I would make this short. The only point that I would disagree with Simon on, it's a half disagreement. And I don't even know if the business about the over-reliance on professionals. People who are depressed, even if it's functional, they do need some kind of help. And I don't know that it has to be professional help, but one thing that we know is if we take someone who's depressed and say we put them on a waiting list, nothing happens. They don't get it. Anything else we do will do something for at least some of them. The sad thing is that perhaps the majority of depressed people don't benefit from any of our treatments to any substantial degree. That's the bad news. The good news is that just about anything we do, as long as we do something, is better than an antidepressant drug in terms of risk-benefit. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Irving. That was a very useful point. I'm now going to turn over to Simon. Irving's point is that if you don't have a therapist, you don't get better. I'm just going to add in another, because I feel that we need to sort of get a little bit more challenging going, is an additional point, which is that a therapist could be considered part of a lifestyle modification. So that if you haven't got any friends and you go and see a nice therapist, at least you're going to see someone who's nice to you and is part of your life.
I'm glad you brought that one up, Michael. Yeah, it is. And actually, if you look at statistically, a study by Refin 2 years ago, they were looking at the level of social contact that people with severe and enduring problems had. And the majority of social contact that somebody has in their personal life who is without illness is around 7 to 8 a week. Those with 2 a week. I think one of them equates to the CPN or the social worker or the psychiatrist or the whoever's involved in that intervention. Is that healthy or is that dependency? Does that reflect the real world? What happens when that intervention ends? If that worker was looking at their life and around and looking at embedding a real a social life to within that person's life, then I think it would be a benefit. But as long as they're there, what we must never forget is it's an artificial intervention which does not reflect reality whatsoever. Or it does at the moment, but in time with lots of other cuts, it won't, I think. But to come back to your point about, I hope I clarified that it wasn't about doing nothing, but I think the problem is more of a cultural problem. The cultural problem now is that we almost feel that we, as family members, friends, carers, whatever way you want to look at us, are unable to help that person. Our schools don't really teach us humanity anymore as a child, do they? We get taught, we have a hierarchy of science, maths, English, right down to the arts. Where is it about being a human? Where does that fit into probably the most primary, most important thing about being human? Why do we have young pregnancies? Why do we have people showing off? Why do we compete with each other? Let's teach children these things. Those things actually influence us about who we become. And I think children can grasp that kind of thing. And I think if we start bringing that bit out in schools, I think what we're doing then is we're educating people how to be human, how to think, how to solve problems. And I think at the moment, the cultural problem is that nobody feels they have the expertise to deal with these kind of problems, it has to be a therapist who's studied for 4 years. And I'm telling you this, that is no guarantee that you're going to get a good therapist. Most of my experience is that they're not very good, and actually they bring their ego to it. And when they come up against people like me, who have something to say, who are you? I've been doing this for 14 years. Really effectively, you should see my outcomes. And I think that's potentially dangerous, and I think what it actually does is it takes away the responsibility from us as individuals and as communities to actually support each other. And we don't even necessarily need to, if I focused on my problems, you know, I'm not belittling this, but I suffered terrible abuse as a young boy. I don't see that as a poor me story. For a number of years I did, I poured me lots of them. But I don't do that anymore. But actually that kind of made me who I am, and I've lost my trail of thought. Do they want to remind me? But I think that, I think actually that gave me a strength, and it gave me to look at what many of the problems are. And I really do think that it's about us actually being able to take on that role, take some responsibility about being humans, looking at ourselves, and actually look at relationships and not be so egocentric and focused on ourselves. When we go into situations with people, we're not really thinking about them. The only time we think about them is making sure that they like us. You know, we're so egocentric, you know, it's all about, oh God, how are they going to perceive me? We don't even see the person so much anymore, and I think that is a cultural problem. I think that's a very individualistic culture that we live in. And I do think that bears on things. I think we'd be naive to think that it doesn't. I hope that's kind of gone some way, Evan. So I'm not saying that they don't have a role either, and I'm not saying that. There are some people who can be inspirational, but it wasn't therapists that changed my life. It was a support worker who came from a very different culture called Hakan, a Turk Cypriot. And rather than cut me down as a tall poppy, Hakan looked at me and he said, but Simon, I can't do his voice. He said, you have skill, you know, you're influential, you have a brain, use it. And it was that belief in me that he installed in me that made me want to put my 5p's worth in and change my life. It wasn't my CPN. No, you can't work. It wasn't my psychiatrist, you must take this medication. It wasn't anyone else involved in my care who actually lowered my expectations. Lowered them, you can't do this. But I was fortunate. I wasn't that 18-year-old who just got a diagnosis because diseases form at 18 in the DSM classification system. I was that guy who actually went into I was 27 saying, shut up services, I want to work, I want to live. So I'd seen an alternative life. The ones I feel for are the 18-year-olds who get diagnosed, come straight out of school, they haven't achieved very much in school because the problems have already been there. They already have that low self-esteem associated with that. They've never experienced a working life, and when they're told this is bad for you, not only do they think it's bad for them, but their families think it's bad for them, their friends think it's bad for them, society thinks it's bad for them. They have nothing to compare it with. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Thank you.
Well, we do seem to be coming to some kind of consensus that depression is a lifestyle disease and it has a lifestyle cure. What that particular lifestyle cure should be, of course, is a challenge. But that is some of the consensus we seem to be coming to. I'd like to open this up to see if anyone from the floor would like to raise a point. Yes. Could you I think you'll need a microphone, so could you come to the front? Would you mind coming to the front?
So I was curious about the idea of professional intervention. I sort of think that it can be useful in that it often gives families and other people sort of like a professional sort of call to know what to do. Often it's very difficult dealing with people or living with people who have mental health problems. So do you think it's a problem with the actual idea of there being a professional intervention, or do you think that the professional interventions themselves can actually just get better? And is there any scope for that within a medical model as well of depression, rather than just viewing it as a response to difficult life events?
Can I ask both Irving and Simon to respond to that, please? Simon first.
Yes. Yeah, I do think it can be embedded in the medical model. I think it would be a welcoming addition to the medical model, but I think the first question that the medical model or the team that are delivering that should ask is to the carer and to the natural support systems, what do you need? What do you need functionally? What do you really need in your life aside from any very specific intervention? Because if we keep real social relationships, real social support alive, not only are we reducing the economic cost of having to have all these additional support services in, which cost an awful lot of money, but at the same time what we find, what the research shows us, is if you keep that natural support system alive, They have fewer episodes, reduced symptom profiles, less dependency on secondary care, less hospitalisations, and are more likely to go and return to work. So I think that should be and I do think they have their place, but I truly think it comes down to the individual. Because I've met people who are extremely skilled and they've taken on every course, but they're not the ones who made the difference. It was that support worker, who, yeah, he had a postgraduate, but it was him, but it was what he saw in me. And I don't think I think that's something that is innate in all of us, or should be, is it's humanity. And that doesn't necessarily require 4 years of study as a postgraduate study, really. I'm not too sure it does.
Right, thank you, Simon. Now it's for Irving to respond, please.
Some years ago, there was a big, massive study sponsored by the National Institute of Mental Health in the U.S. On the treatment of depression, looking at drug therapy and psychotherapy, not finding much difference between them, and outcomes not finding much difference between either of them and placebo. This was back in the late 1980s. One of the follow-ups they did was to look at within the group that had gotten psychotherapy to see what predicted who responded well to psychotherapy, and what they found was that there was a therapist difference. And they identified at least one therapist difference that predicted how much people proved in treatment for depression. And that difference was the degree to which the therapist was willing to focus in the session on things like employment, housing, and other economic factors. Part of my problem with the medical model, we know that when unemployment goes up, depression goes up. When unemployment goes down, depression goes down. I don't think would suggest that unemployment is causing a disease. You're having a natural reaction in that case to economic hardship. If you want to see one of the greatest culprits for the increase in depression right now globally, it may be the austerity measures, excuse me for bringing politics into this, that are being imposed to get us out of the economic crisis that were not caused by the people who are asked to live a more austere life right now.
We've got one here, and then we'll come one up over there. So Susan next.
Thanks. Simon, I want to ask about this term cerebral health. Everything that you've talked about is kind of holistic, the whole life, social life. The cerebrum, it's just this tiny bit in here. It seems to me a backward move. It's like going even more into the medical model to say it's all about the brain. It's not all about the brain. It's the body, the emotions, and the social life, and everything else.
It's really good. I'm ready for that one too, I hope. Because I put a lot of thought into that, and I accept that. And actually, you're not the first person who challenged me with that. The cerebral cortex is really what I would say the new brain, the thinking brain, and that was really because I think, look, what I'm saying about the medical model and the biological model, I'm not anti-biology. This is biology. There's no doubt that what is fundamentally going on, what that doesn't rule out is what's going on out there. I think what's important is that I acknowledge what's going on out there affects here. What I'm trying to move away from is this idea that it's something to do with spirituality. Now, I'm not going into a debate about religion. What I'm saying is, yes, it is organic. There's no way away from the fact that it's organic. But that doesn't disclude the fact that what goes on out here affects what's going on in here. But what it does do, the term mental, and the reason I went away from mental is, look, you read 96% of stories in newspapers. Axe-wielding maniac kills child, kills mother, rapes child. What about me? Does my story get in there? It would be a triumph for the human race, wouldn't it? Oh, what a triumph. He set up his own little business, look. But I don't get into the newspaper. All we focus on is the danger associated with it. And I think the term mental, or it can be used in a positive way. I work with young people for a long time. That's mental, and that's really good. But when I hear the term mental, I think of someone who's dangerous, who, because of some religious thinking as well, is that they're fundamentally corrupt, sinners. And I know whatever term you use is going to take on new connotations. In learning disability, we hear the term cretin. Things like idiot, savant. They probably didn't mean what they meant in the beginning, but they take on that in the playground. You know, those terms take on something. Idiot takes on something in the playground. Cretin takes on. So whatever it is, I think cerebral would be a difficult one. It's a bit like the spastic society becoming scope, isn't it? You don't go around going, oh, scopy. And I did nick that off Ricky Gervais. But yeah, so I take your point.
Thank you, and Susan made a very good point there, because I can't resist telling you this, that when you're depressed, your immune system exhibits a very abnormal pattern of heightened pro-inflammatory cytokines. Don't worry that is. Basically, it's associated with stress. So the idea that the depression is just something which happens in the brain and it involves transmitter substance really doesn't match that. Furthermore, there's an awful lot of neurons in the gut, and immune learning takes place in the gut, so you could say that depression is in the gut. It's a rather complicated thing, because when people are depressed, they also have all kinds of gut problems as well. So it is an extremely complicated point. Simon did mention earlier that the body, or the brain, is a complex machine, and suggested that the other bits are not complex. I think the whole body is very complex. We've got one more question over here, and then we'll...
This will work through with it. Our psychiatrist friend has looked at depression from the statistical point of view, and I agree that has a very important part in this discussion, because we're talking about medication as it relates to depression. Our friend here has talked to personal anecdotes as it relates to his experience of manic depression. Well, personal anecdotes have a place, I think, in this discussion. Personally, I was diagnosed manic depressive 35 years ago, and in all that time I've been virtually nothing but a psychiatric patient. I wasn't relating to it. My life had no significance at all. 2 years, I've had 300 interviews with psychiatrists. I don't think I've ever seen a psychiatrist without putting me under pressure to change the medication. I must have been on something like 20 different drugs at some time or another. 2 years ago, I thought, well, I'll take myself off these drugs. And okay, I was hit by manic depression. I've had some very severe bouts of despair, but I also had elation. But I've also had the tragedy back in my life, and the passion. And I've been able to relate to people on a personal level I could never see before. And my life has quite a significance that it hasn't had for such a long time. And I know in my relations with women, with art, with music, I find they have a power over me that was totally absent for 35 years. And I'd like to say there's some suggestion that maybe manic depression, maybe your depression has some evolutionary advantage. But what I would like to also say is, since I came off medication, I had an absolute outpouring of creative thinking. I'm making listening sounds here. What I do, if I can get my thoughts again. What I'd like to say is that many of the books I come up with, my whole life I'm throwing all my life's experiences into a cauldron now. Everything I've ever learned from life is going to the cauldron. It might turn out that at the end of the day what I get is dishwater, but I'm hoping, and I'm seeing signs that something coming out of that cauldron is actually quite an interesting new soup.
Thank you very much for that very powerful expression. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you both about what you thought of the role of nutritional supplements in treating depression.
Well, I'm an empiricist, so I'm waiting to see the studies, and I won't comment one way or another until I've seen some good outcome research showing whether it has an effect or not.
I'll come to that point, but I just wanted to actually just come on to something there and straight away address that, because I think you alluded to an extremely important point about risk. The medical model and medical care is totally risk averse. You're wrapped in cotton wool. If you cry, you're going to commit suicide. No, that doesn't happen. You know, you're wrapped, oh no, you can't do that. Oh, don't get involved in that relationship, you could cry. You know, and I think you've alluded to something extremely powerful there, is actually what we should be doing is encouraging people to take risk, because that's how you learn. That's life. You make stupid decisions in your lives. You know, you go out with the wrong person, you invest your money where you shouldn't, you make a bad decision, you cheat, you lie, whatever, we all do it. But you touched on something really important, and you took that risk, and you've experienced what you have from there. And my term is every cloud, because my most innovative thinking comes when I'm hypomanic, which is about 4 or 5 times a year. And I quite enjoy that, I just don't get that anymore. But thank you. Nutrition. I find this one hard to take myself out of this one with some kind of emotion. As a young boy in a very difficult family environment, my mum always put down all of my behavioural problems down to food colourings. So I was robbed of Coke and I was given water. She could have offered, and I wasn't allowed Ribena, and even though I knew it was rubbish, and actually it probably accounts for less than 0.5% of anyone with ADHD symptomology, is I still won't touch Vimto, I still won't touch Ribena. I can't do it, no matter how diluted. And then I see these other families where you can see the real problem in the social behaviour is the interaction of the family, but they're given fish oils, because that's the cause of all those behavioural problems. And even though that's not intrinsically linked to depression, I think there is something appealing about that. And I can't rule it out, because in some ways you are what you eat. You know, if you're hypoglycemic or something, you know, you're going to have a reaction and blah, blah, blah. I think there is some truth, but what I find with people who hope that is that it almost becomes 95% of it is because of what you eat. And I think that does miss the point that we do see brain changes. In this kind of schizophrenic brain and things like that, there are differences. Well, that's another debate, but yeah, okay.
Can I just add one thing on the question of food supplements? There has been research on it. I'm not going to tell you what the results are, but I'll tell you this. If there was an easy cure through fish supplements, wouldn't we all be doing it now? Oh, no. Have we got any more points? Yes, we have. Would you like to come forward and make your point, please? Thank you.
I can take your point about the professional interventions. I've been a service user, and I suppose I still am a service user, but I'm also training to be a clinical psychologist. And I was just thinking maybe it's more to do with the fact that we are, as a profession, renowned for being precious with our knowledge, and it's more about trying to empower communities to actually give the support to their families and their friends and their loved ones, because I was never involved in my mum's care as a young person or a child. So maybe it's about working together rather than trying to discourage getting professional interventions and help.
I totally agree. I don't think there's any disagreement there at all. I'll just let you in on something though, because the best therapist I ever saw was a 12-year-old girl whose father had been in and out of Glenbourne, the inpatient unit, for 12, 13 years, all of her life. She turned around at 12 years old, she said, "My dad needs this, my dad needs to look at employment, he needs more social contact, he doesn't need to be in here, don't stop dribbling." She knew that at 12, so I think actually maybe what these services often do to us is take that away from us. And the bit I'm not so comfortable with is about us needing them to empower us. I think if you have knowledge, and yeah, there is stuff to be gained from knowledge. I study psychology, I look at that, I take knowledge from that, and I think I have some things through my reading which I could suggest to other people. But I don't think intrinsically they need to be providers, but I think what you're saying is dead right, is that actually they should maybe see their role more about empowering others. And I think a part of that is about, in social work and psychiatry and psychology, they always talk about reflective practice. Reflective practice, reflective practice, reflect, but it's never done. And I know that sounds controversial, but it's not. And when it is it as effective as it could be? Are we actually encouraging them to be as honest about their own humanity, about their egos? I'm not so sure we do. I think we have to have a welcoming community that actually allows people to discuss and display their prejudice, their discrimination, their vulnerability, and where their ego interferes. And I think that would go some way to doing what you're suggesting. And I think you're right, yeah.
Right, are there any more points? Yes, we've got one at the back. Can you manage to find your way forward, or do you want to shout?
So the idea that something that's not really designed to affect the neurons of the brain will have an impact. It's not a very surprising idea. The other thing was the notion of risk-taking in mental health problems. Like, a lot of mental health problems actually kill people, and they generally kill people because they get situations they can no longer cope with. And that is in part due to risk-taking. So I think, yeah, we should go open to their full lives, obviously, but at the same time, there needs to be some sort of awareness of the responsibility there towards these people.
Come back to that. Yeah, I think, you know, I don't think anyone could doubt that when I'm manic and I think where we've got to be careful here is about how I'm framing risk. I'm not framing risk when I'm in this severe manic state where probably I have no insight and I don't quite know where I am, or that I'm totally deluded and then I could act in, and I have acted against my best interests. I've made some big social mistakes. And the strange thing is that the team's generally doesn't know what's going on at that point, which is a real concern. You know, they know after the fire's, oh, we better put the fire out, but you could have stopped the fire from developing in the first place. But I think where I'm coming from with risk is that what happens is when you come out of that episode and you end up in this, you know, secondary care service, specialised mental health service, you're never allowed to take any risk. Don't try and work. Don't go into employment. No. If you start that relationship, it could have real consequences. Let me take that chance and let me learn from it. And yeah, you can make serious social faux pas, and I've lost lots of things because of that. And I don't know if you ever live or learn, and maybe you do need someone. But couldn't the team, as was suggested here, in a sense, couldn't what the team are doing is actually facilitate other people in your real world to take on that role of identifying when those things are becoming problematic, and actually them supporting you to manage it. So it's a real world intervention. That's my point.
We'll have just one more point.
Hi, I've got 17 years experience of being in the mental health system, having bipolar disorder, which was diagnosed as manic depression all them years ago. And I agree with what everyone here is saying. There is a place for professionals, but I think it's the attitude now that needs to be changed towards how we are portrayed. And again, Simon touched on it. For 10, 12, 15 years of my life, you know, I was told that I couldn't do things and that I wasn't working because I was so heavily medicated. And again, I was 18 still. I went to lots of places to get help. I ended up with weight loss surgery on the NHS because that's what made me well. But the thing wasn't made me pretty well was a good psychiatrist I had for 5 years who's no longer in clinic. His name was Dr. Andrew Montgomery, and he was the one who listened, who helped me when I got to the stage where I researched my mood stabiliser and oxygen, and was willing to give me a chance to try this medication 7 years ago, which I would say saved my life. My life hasn't been perfect. I had an episode at the beginning of this year where I did make an attempt on my life because things were getting hard. And the first thing I did when they took me to hospital was change over medication. But until I reached that rock bottom again and said, and I tell you, I was in a serious situation where it took them a lot for me to bring me round, which is not a nice experience to talk about. But it was basically, that was the end for me. But luckily I was saved by a great team at Derry Hospital and my family. And it wasn't until I came through that I said, look, I want to go back on the medication I've been on. I don't want to change my medication. I want to do this. There's certain health professions that I don't want to be involved in my life because for years they've intimidated me. And now, after all this time, and until this day, that I can actually say that I am in control of my life in all this time is true. Thank you.
Thank you again for that very powerful testimony. Thank you. Well, we're coming to the end of this evening. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. I think we are surprisingly in agreement between two individuals who I thought there might be more disagreement. I would like to leave you with one historical thought, which is we're coming to the conclusion we're coming to, which is very much looking on depression in terms of lifestyle. At the end of Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, written in 1638, he looks at the various alternative therapies and he comes up with his own particular recommendation for himself. And it is this: work hard and spend time with your friends. Thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen. Have a good evening.